My own stepmother looked the judge right in the eyes and said I was mentally incompetent. She said I had been unbalanced for years, that I had lived under constant medical supervision, that I should never be allowed to manage my own estate, let alone inherit what my mother had left for me. I was sitting there in civil court number 47 in Chicago on March 14th, wearing the silver owl pendant my mother gave me when I turned 12. And I didn't say a single word, not yet. But before I keep telling you this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let me know in the comments where in the States or the world you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. The judge, a woman in her 60s with deep auburn hair and small glasses hanging from a gold chain, listened to my stepmother's lawyer finish his opening statement. Then she turned to him with an expression I had seen before. Many times, actually. It was the look of someone who knows the difference between a story and the truth, and who had already decided which of the two she was hearing. She looked at Stephen Renteria, a polished lawyer in his early 40s, wearing a watch way too expensive for his age, and asked him a simple question. "Counselor, do you know who you are accusing?" "The woman your client just called mentally incompetent." Stephen blinked, looked at his papers, looked at me, and looked back at the judge. My stepmother's face went from absolute confidence to confusion, and then to a pale sheet that spread from her neck to her forehead in a matter of seconds. Let me tell you how I ended up sitting in that courtroom. My name is Renee Hollis. I'm 37 years old, and I'm a digital forensic investigator specializing in digital financial crimes. I've worked for 11 years at a firm that consults for the FBI and federal prosecutors on cases of wire fraud, digital money laundering, and financial abuse against seniors scammed through bank transfers or mobile apps. I've testified as an expert witness in 56 cases. 41 of them ended in a guilty verdict. 19 of those testimonies were given in the courtroom of Magistrate Lauren Vance, the exact same judge who was currently presiding over the hearing where my stepmother was trying to declare me insane. 3 years ago, after a particularly grueling case against a ring that defrauded over 200 retirees in Newark, the judge told me during a recess that I was one of the most rigorous forensic experts she had seen in her 28 years on the bench. My stepmother didn't know any of this. We hadn't spoken in 18 years, and until 7 months ago, she didn't even have my current phone number. Here is what you need to understand about my stepmother, Audrey Vance. My mom died of breast cancer when I was 14. Her name was Lucy Hollis. She was a librarian at Columbia University and taught archiving workshops on Saturday mornings. She was a careful, methodical woman, the kind who wrote everything down by hand in hardcover notebooks and stuck adhesive labels on every drawer in the house. When she knew she was going to die, she got her affairs in order. She spoke with a notary. She set up a trust fund in my name with a bank she handpicked. She left very specific instructions for my father. And here is the crucial part. My mom knew my dad. She knew he was a weak man, easily manipulated, incapable of making tough decisions on his own. That's why she placed the trust under crystal clear conditions. I would get a piece at 18 for my education, another piece at 25 for my first steps into adulthood, and the biggest chunk, the brownstone in Brooklyn Heights that belonged to my maternal grandmother, valued at roughly $8.4 million, along with an investment fund of $3.2 million, I would receive upon turning 37. My mom figured that by then, I'd be grounded enough to manage all of it with a cool head. My mom died on a Tuesday. My dad married Audrey Vance 7 months later. They met at a travel agency where Audrey worked at the counter. She was 10 years younger than him, divorced with a daughter from a previous marriage. For my dad, a guy who felt profoundly alone, she was a life raft. For me, It was the confirmation that my mother had died twice. Audrey never loved me. It's important to state that clearly. It wasn't that we had differences or misunderstandings. It wasn't a complicated relationship. She simply didn't want me in her new life. When I was 16 and starting high school, she told me it would be best for everyone if I went to live with my aunt and uncle in Ohio. My dad didn't put up a fight. He didn't come to my graduations. He didn't call on birthdays. He just wired money. And that was it. I finished high school in Ohio. I moved back to Chicago for college. I studied computer engineering at Northwestern, followed by a specialization in cybersecurity and forensic analysis. My dad and I kept a distant but polite relationship. We grabbed lunch twice a year on my birthday and Christmas Eve. Audrey always managed to be conveniently absent. I didn't miss her. My dad died 7 months ago from a massive heart attack. He was 71. They found him at his desk with a half-empty mug of coffee and a crossword puzzle open next to it. I went to the funeral. Audrey was there too, of course, dressed in flawless black, crying just enough to keep up appearances. Her daughter Maya stood right beside her, quiet and pale. I didn't approach them. After the funeral, I went to the office of the estate lawyer. My mom had used the same firm, now run by his successor, Hugh Barnes. He walked me through the conditions of my mother's trust. I was turning 37 in 4 months. The inheritance would trigger automatically. My dad, in his separate will, had also left me a small sum from his personal estate and a few sentimental items. 3 weeks after the burial, I got a heavy envelope from Stephen Renteria's law firm. My stepmother was filing a petition for guardianship over me. In legal terms, she was asking a judge to declare me mentally unfit to manage my own assets. The petition was 38 pages long. It claimed I had suffered a severe depressive episode at 14 after my mother's death. That was true. Any 14-year-old girl whose mother just died gets depressed. It's the most normal thing in the world. A grief counselor from Family Services saw me for 6 months. Those session notes, buried and forgotten for over 2 decades, were now being weaponized as proof of a chronic pattern of mental instability. But there was more. The filing included a signed affidavit from Maya Audrey's daughter, stating that she had always been concerned about my mental health, that she had seen me behave erratically during our few family encounters, and that she seriously doubted my capacity to manage a substantial estate. Maya was 9 the last time I saw her. She was 30 now. Over 20 years had passed. She knew absolutely nothing about me. The petition also requested urgent preliminary injunctions. She wanted the judge to freeze the trust assets immediately. She wanted a temporary conservator appointed to manage everything until the case was resolved. The proposed conservator was obviously Audrey Vance herself, acting in her capacity as my father's widow, and as she claimed the only functional family I had left. I laughed when I read it. I laughed out loud, sitting alone in my apartment in Lincoln Park, my coffee going cold next to my laptop. Then I stopped laughing because I realized what it actually meant. Once someone files a petition like this in court, it doesn't matter if it's ridiculous. It doesn't matter if the evidence is paper thin. The machine starts moving. You have to hire a lawyer. You have to show up to hearings. You have to prove to a judge that you aren't crazy. And while all of that is happening, the news spreads. My boss, Arthur Teller, called me into his office the day after the docket went public. He's a decent man who hired me when I was barely 26, and nobody else wanted to give me a shot. He believed in me. He knew the filing was absurd, but as he explained with that painful bluntness, honest people have, the firm couldn't retain an expert witness whose mental capacity was being questioned in a courtroom in the very same city. They didn't fire me, but they suspended me from active duty. No new forensics, no testimonies, no access to ongoing files. 11 years building my reputation, and my stepmother was tearing it down with one call to an overpriced lawyer. That night, I called my partner, Matthew. Matthew is a literature teacher at a public high school on the South Side. I met him 4 years ago in a bookstore in Wicker Park. He is a calm, kind man, and he comes from a family where Sunday dinner is a sacred institution. His parents have been married for 41 years. He doesn't understand family dysfunction the way I do. He told me that maybe my stepmother was just going through a hard time after my dad's passing, that maybe it was a misunderstanding, that maybe we should try talking to her first. I love Matthew, I really do, but sometimes he says things that make me wonder if he's ever met a real human being outside of the novels he teaches. Audrey knew exactly what my inheritance was worth. She had put it in a legal document. But she didn't know if my birthday was in July or September. Funny how memory works when money is on the table. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation got worse. I started investigating on my own because that's what I do. It's what my mom taught me when I was a kid sitting with her on Saturday mornings while she balanced her checkbook at the dining table. She used to say, "Numbers don't lie." She said people can spin any story they want, but financial records tell the truth, if you know how to read them. I started with the most obvious thread. My dad and I shared access to a joint bank account he had opened when I turned 25, supposedly to wire me the intermediate trust payments I had received. That account was still active, and I was still a joint holder. My dad never revoked access. He probably just forgot. Audrey certainly didn't know I still had the login. I logged into the bank. Portal downloaded the statements from the last 2 years, and right there, I found the first crack in the official narrative. In the 14 months leading up to my dad's death, there were 16 outgoing wire transfers from that account to a personal account under Audrey Vance's name. The amounts ranged from $1,800 to $4,700. The total hit $41,200. Every single one of those transfers had been authorized using my father's digital security token. But there was one detail that caught my eye. 13 of those 16 transfers were executed between 2 and 4 in the morning. My dad went to bed at 10:30 p.m. every day of his life without exception. He was a man of rigid habits. He hadn't made those transfers. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen island with 2 thermoses of black coffee and an open spreadsheet, and I worked for 12 hours straight. When I was done, I had a precise map of how Audrey had been siphoning money from my father during the last 14 months of his life. But the bank statements were just the beginning. I knew I had to dig deeper. The following Saturday, I drove to the house where my dad and Audrey lived in Oak Park. Audrey wasn't there. She had gone to Lake Geneva with her daughter for the weekend, according to a text she sent one of my dad's mutual friends. I still had the keys. My dad gave them to me on his last birthday when I helped him set up his new computer. He told me almost in a whisper to keep them, that someday I might need them. I didn't know what he meant back then. Now I did. I walked into the house. It smelled different than I remembered. Audrey had swapped out all the furniture, repainted the walls, erased my mother piece by piece over 2 decades. But my father's desk was exactly the same. It was the heavy dark wood desk he had inherited from his father. I went up to his study and booted up the computer. I knew the password because I had set it up myself, and I started looking. My dad, just like my mom, was methodical. He saved everything, folders organized by year, subfolders by month, PDF files of every bank statement, every receipt, every important document from the last 15 years. I found something that made me stop and take a deep breath. A folder simply named For Renee, created 3 weeks before his death. Inside were 6 files. One was a letter he wrote addressed to me. He explained that something had been going on in his marriage over the last few years, that he suspected Audrey was bleeding him dry, but he hadn't been able to fully prove it. He said he was terrified that after he was gone, she would try to seize things that didn't belong to her. He told me he had secretly hired an external forensic accountant to audit his finances, but the report hadn't arrived yet. He begged for my forgiveness, for letting them push me away, for being weak, for not fighting for me when he was supposed to. He said he hoped someday I could understand. The other 5 files were screenshots, exported emails, and wire confirmations he had quietly documented over the past few months. It wasn't entirely conclusive on its own, but it was the confirmation that my dad knew. He knew something was terribly wrong. I cried in his leather chair for an hour. Then I wiped my face, copied all the files onto a flash drive, and kept digging. I found the report from the accountant my dad had hired. It had arrived 2 weeks before he died. The CPA, a guy named Fred Salinger, had flagged a systematic pattern of cash outflows with zero accounting justification. He had requested a sit-down with my dad to discuss the findings, but that meeting never happened. My dad died first. I started looking into Fred Salinger. I found him. He worked at a boutique accounting firm downtown. I called him the following Monday. He agreed to see me. When I explained who I was and what was happening, he went dead silent for a long time. Then he told me he had tried to contact the widow after my dad's passing to hand over the full report. Audrey had told him it wasn't necessary, that she would handle everything, that she would pay his invoice, and that he should destroy any copies. Fred hadn't destroyed a thing. He was an accountant with a moral compass. He handed me a digital copy of the complete audit. It was 64 pages long. While I was building my case file, I decided to run a background check on Audrey herself. Professional habit, I guess. I wanted to know exactly what kind of predator I was dealing with. What I found made my stomach turn. Audrey had been married before to a man named Oliver Perry, a textile importer who died in 2003, 2 years before she met my dad. The official cause of death was a heart attack, just like my dad. Back then, Oliver's kids from a previous marriage had contested the estate. They accused Audrey of liquidating their father's assets before and right after his death without legal authorization. The case never reached a formal trial because the kids, as I managed to scrape from some archived legal forms, had taken an out-of-court settlement and signed a non-disclosure agreement. But there was more. Before Oliver, Audrey had been in a long-term relationship with an older man. They weren't legally married, but they lived together. That man, according to the records I pieced together, died in 1998, also under circumstances his family described as highly suspicious. My stepmother wasn't just a woman who coincidentally married older men twice. It was a pattern, and my father hadn't been the first, nor likely the last. I was just the only one who knew how to fight back. I called my attorney, Beatrice Donovan. Beatrice is 52, spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor, and then pivoted to civil litigation. She is blunt, has zero patience for nonsense, and harbors a deep-seated hatred for lawyers who prey on broken families. I laid it all out for her. The wire transfers my dad's letter, the audit report, the dead husband pattern. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long, heavy minute. Then she asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to walk into that courtroom, let my stepmother and her lawyer scream whatever they wanted, let them commit to their lies under oath, and then detonate the truth. I wanted the judge to see exactly who Audrey was before showing her who I was. Beatrice smiled. She said she was hoping I'd say that. The hearing date was set for March 14th. That gave me 7 weeks to prepare. I worked it like I work any case. I built a master file. I cross-referenced everything. I triple-checked every data point. Beatrice filed my response to the petition, and it was deliberately bare bones. I denied all allegations. I stated I was fully competent. I requested a hearing. No attached evidence, no counterclaims, absolutely nothing that would tip them off. Stephen Renteria called Beatrice the next day. He sounded confused, almost amused. "That's it? That's the whole defense," Beatrice told him. I was very much looking forward to my day in court. Stephen probably thought I was just a weak woman trying to put on a brave face. 2 weeks before the hearing, he scheduled my initial deposition. I gave him the bare minimum. I'm a computer engineer. I work at a firm. No, I haven't had recent psychiatric treatment. Yes, I saw a grief counselor when I was 14, after my mother died. 3-word answers. No elaboration, no defensiveness, no explanations. Audrey was watching the deposition via video conference. I could see her face in the corner of the screen. I watched her expression shift from tense to relaxed to downright smug over those 2 hours. She thought I was defeated. She thought I had no ammo. She had no idea she was looking at a woman who had interrogated hackers, money launderers, and Ponzi scheme operators for 11 years. She had no idea the boring monosyllabic woman on her screen was putting on a masterclass performance. I never considered myself a good actress, but that was my magnum opus. The week before the hearing, something happened that I didn't see coming. Maya Perry, Audrey's daughter, reached out to me via a direct message on a professional network. She wanted to meet. Beatrice advised me not to go. She said it could be a trap, that Audrey might be using her kid to fish for something they could use in court. But I had noticed something during the video deposition. Whenever Stephen mentioned my dad's name, Maya's jaw clenched tight. Whenever Audrey chuckled at one of the lawyer's snide remarks, Maya stared a hole into the ceiling. There was something there. Fear, maybe, or resentment, or both. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in Wicker Park. Neutral ground. Maya showed up 15 minutes late. She wasn't what I expected. She was painfully thin, with dark circles under her eyes, and fingernails bitten down to the quick. She ordered an Americano and didn't touch it. She told me she was deeply sorry about the affidavit she had signed. She said her mom had drafted it, and she just signed it without really reading it, because she didn't have the fight left in her to argue with her mother about anything anymore. I asked her what she meant by that. She took a long time to answer. Then, she told me about her biological dad, Oliver Perry. She told me that when he died, she was 9, and within months, her mom had liquidated everything he left behind, including a commercial storefront downtown that had been his lifelong dream. She said her mom changed after that, became colder, more calculating. She told me that when she met my dad, new things started appearing in their house. New trips, new jewelry. But my dad never seemed particularly wealthy. And as a teenager, she started asking questions. She told me that 3 years ago, she confronted her mom about a large sum of cash that had vanished from the house. She didn't tell me exactly what happened after that conversation, but she instinctively pulled at the left sleeve of her sweater, covering her forearm. I understood. I asked her why she was telling me all this. She said she was exhausted. She said she had been carrying this weight for years, and she just couldn't do it anymore. She said she knew exactly what was going to happen in that courtroom, and she wasn't going to let her mother drag her down with the ship. I told her I couldn't promise her any formal protection, but if she was willing to tell the truth under oath, I would make sure the district attorney knew she had cooperated. She agreed. I drove back home that night, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not just hope that I would win, but hope that somewhere in this world, something resembling justice still existed. Matthew was waiting for me at the apartment. He had picked up takeout from a deep dish pizza place I love in the Loop. He told me he had been thinking a lot about what he said weeks ago. The part about a misunderstanding and talking to my stepmother. He told me he was wrong. He said he had let his own sheltered biases about what a normal family looks like blind him to the reality of mine. I showed him my dad's digital folder. I showed him the wire transfers. I showed him the CPA's audit. I showed him the pattern with Oliver Perry. He read it all in dead silence. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even anger on my behalf. It was pure respect. He asked me what I needed him to do. I told him I needed him in that courtroom. I needed him to watch me work. He told me he wouldn't miss it for the world. The night before the hearing, I drove to Graceland Cemetery, where my mom is buried. The gates were locked, but I parked across the street and sat in my car for half an hour, staring into the dark silhouette of the trees, thinking about everything she had taught me. Records don't lie. People can spin any story they want, but the data tells the truth. Tomorrow, the data was going to speak for itself. On March 14th, I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 in the morning. I was early because that's just who I am. I wore a dark charcoal blazer, a crisp white blouse, and my mother's silver owl pendant. I didn't wear it to send a message. I wore it because she would have wanted to be there with me. Courtroom 47 was smaller than the federal courts, where I usually testify. There were benches for about 20 people. Matthew sat in the back row. Beatrice sat next to me at the defense table, resting her hands on a black leather briefcase, stuffed with documents my stepmother had no idea existed. Audrey walked in at 9:30. She was late on purpose, I assume, because that's what people do when they need to feel like they own the room. She was wearing a tailored navy blue suit and a pair of pearl earrings that I recognized instantly. They were my mother's earrings. My mom had inherited them from her mother. Audrey must have raided the jewelry box while my dad was sick, or maybe even before. That single detail, I don't know why, made my blood boil hotter than everything else combined. Behind Audrey walked Stephen Renteria, adjusting his silk tie, and behind him, staring a hole into the floor, came Maya. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She sat at the far end of the petitioner's bench and just stared at her hands for the entire hearing. All rise. Hearing presided by Magistrate Lauren Vance. The judge walked in, took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and opened the docket. Then she looked over at the petitioner's table. Then she looked at me. I saw the exact moment it clicked. A micro nod of recognition. She didn't say a word, but I knew she knew. Stephen launched into his opening statement. He talked for about 20 minutes, painting the heartbreaking portrait of a deeply concerned stepmother, a woman who had fought for years to keep an emotionally fragile stepdaughter folded into the family dynamic, a woman who now, after the tragic loss of her husband, only wanted to honor a good man's final wishes by ensuring his estate didn't fall into incompetent hands. He submitted the grief counselor's notes from 23 years ago as bulletproof evidence of a chronic disorder. He submitted Maya's affidavit regarding my supposedly erratic behavior. Never, not once, did he mention what I did for a living. He didn't bother digging past a basic Google search. He assumed a computer engineer was just a computer engineer. When he finished, Judge Vance asked if the petitioner wished to make a direct personal statement. Audrey stood up, smoothed out her blazer, and started speaking in a soft, trembling voice about her deep concern for my well-being, about my father's dying wishes, about the heavy burden she carried as the only functional family I had left. And then abruptly, her tone shifted. Her voice spiked. She pointed a manicured finger directly at me and practically screamed that I was mentally ill, a completely incompetent woman who had been wildly unstable since childhood, that I should never be allowed to manage a dime, let alone inherit the fortune of a man I had manipulated until his dying breath. I didn't blink. I didn't shift in my chair. I kept my hands folded on the table, and I waited. Judge Vance watched the theatrical outburst without flinching. Then she turned to Stephen Renteria and asked him the question that froze the air in the room. "Counselor, do you actually know who you are accusing the woman your client just called mentally incompetent?" Stephen looked like his brain had short-circuited. He shuffled his papers. He stammered that I was an engineer, a systems engineer, working at some tech firm in the city. The judge stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then she turned to Beatrice. Beatrice stood up. She didn't give a speech. She simply stated that the defense had evidence that would substantially alter the court's understanding of this petition, and she requested permission to submit it. The judge nodded. Beatrice unlatched the briefcase. She handed copies of the evidentiary binder to the bailiff, who handed them to Stephen. She handed another copy to the judge, and she went to work. She started with my professional credentials, my master's in cybersecurity, my federal forensic license, the log of my previous expert testimonies in state and federal courts, including the 19 testimonies I had given right there in Judge Vance's own courtroom. Stephen's face hadn't dropped yet. He probably still thought this was just procedural posturing. Then Beatrice laid out the bank records. She walked through the timeline of the 16 wire transfers executed between 2 and 4 a.m. during the 14 months prior to my father's death, totaling $41,200. Stephen's face started to slip. Next, Beatrice submitted the letter my dad had hidden on his hard drive, addressed to me, written 3 weeks before he died. She read it out loud, in its entirety. The voice of a man who knew a predator was circling his marriage, a man begging for forgiveness in advance. I watched my stepmother's face while Beatrice read. Audrey's expression morphed from righteous indignation to utter bewilderment, then to raw panic, and finally to a suppressed, venomous rage she could barely contain. She wasn't ashamed of what she had done. She was furious she got caught. Then Beatrice dropped the audit report from Fred Salinger. 64 pages of forensic accounting, proving a systematic, calculated draining of assets. Finally, she submitted the dossier I had compiled on Oliver Perry and his suspicious demise. She noted for the record that the district attorney's office had already been notified and an active criminal investigation was being opened for fraud, breach of trust, and the potentially fatal financial exploitation of vulnerable seniors in her past marriages. When Beatrice sat down, the courtroom was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Judge Vance looked at Stephen Renteria. She asked if he had any rebuttal. Stephen choked out a request for a brief recess. The judge granted it. I watched Stephen march over to my stepmother. He leaned down and hissed something in her ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the impact. Audrey's face went from rage to confusion to chalk-white terror. He was telling her who I was. He was telling her I had testified as a fraud expert in this exact room 19 times. He was telling her the judge knew me, that she trusted me, that she had validated my forensic evidence in dozens of felony cases. Audrey looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in 18 years. No mask, no rehearsed smile, no calculated poise she had worn her entire adult life. She just stared at me. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just held her gaze and waited. When the hearing resumed, Stephen stood up and announced his client wished to withdraw the petition. Judge Vance shook her head. She stated that given the severe nature of the evidence presented, this court was not willing to simply archive the docket. She announced the case files were being immediately referred to the district attorney's office for a full criminal probe into the felonies exposed today. She declared the guardianship petition dismissed with prejudice, barring it from ever being filed again. She looked at my stepmother one last time and slammed the gavel. It was over. In under 3 hours, with no screaming, no dramatic brawls, just methodically presented data, and a ruling delivered in a steady voice. That is how real justice works, not with explosions, but with ledgers. The DA moved faster than I expected. The lead prosecutor assigned to the case, an ADA named Esther Miller, called me 4 days after the hearing. She had reviewed the binder, opened a grand jury investigation, and assigned a team of forensic accountants to tear apart my father's and Audrey's finances from the last decade. She had also officially expanded the probe to review the circumstances surrounding Oliver Perry. Audrey Vance was arrested 8 weeks later. The charges aggravated fraud, criminal breach of trust, malicious financial exploitation of an elder, and money laundering. The indictment was 41 pages long. The cold case regarding Oliver Perry was formally reopened by the Major Economic Crimes Bureau. Maya was subpoenaed. She cooperated fully. She handed over boxes of documents she had secretly kept in her apartment for years, papers her mother thought she had shredded, receipts, photocopies of checks, text messages. She cut an immunity deal for her testimony. I don't know if that was entirely fair, but I know Maya had been a victim too, in her own way. The criminal trial dragged on for nearly a year. I testified at the very end, both as the victim's daughter and as the technical expert who tracked and mapped the illicit financial flows. Audrey Vance was sentenced to 11 years in a federal penitentiary in upstate New York. She was ordered to pay full restitution of the stolen funds, plus interest, plus punitive damages. Her assets were seized. The house in Oak Park was put on the market to cover her massive legal debts. I got a letter from my stepmother a few months into her sentence, sent straight from the penitentiary. I didn't open it. I handed it to Beatrice, who read it for me. She told me it was 9 pages of pathetic excuses, self-pity, and blaming everyone else without a single shred of actual remorse. She asked if I wanted to write back. I told her no. Some records just aren't worth reading. The trust fund my mom left me unlocked on my 37th birthday, exactly as she planned 23 years ago. I kept the brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Matthew and I moved in last August. It's an old house with high ceilings and a small courtyard with an orange tree, where my grandmother spent her final years and where my mom spent her childhood summers. I also kept my mother's personal notebook, the one she filled out during the final months of her sickness, writing down the things she wanted me to remember when I grew up. I keep it in my desk drawer, not because I read it often, but because her handwriting is the very last piece of her I have left. Matthew asked me to marry him in December. He did it in the kitchen of the Brooklyn house while I was brewing coffee. It wasn't some grand cinematic proposal. It was quiet, everyday, real, like every good thing that has ever happened to me. I said yes. My mom would have liked him. She always said I was going to need someone who would stay planted when things got ugly. My firm reinstated me 2 weeks after the dismissal hearing. My boss, Arthur Teller, apologized to me in person for ever doubting me even for a second. My first case back on the desk was a 78-year-old widow in Staten Island whose nephew had drained her savings using a mobile cash app. We recovered every last cent. The nephew got 6 years. People sometimes think revenge is about rage, about returning pain, about humiliating the person who broke you. It's not. Real revenge is about equilibrium. It's about making sure that people who think they can just take whatever they want, whenever they want, from whoever they want, learn the hard way that the world doesn't work like that. It's about proving that patience, calculated silence, and meticulous documentation will always obliterate greed and arrogance. My stepmother thought I was weak because I stayed quiet. She thought I was broken because I didn't scream back. She thought she could take what was mine because she had done it to other people and gotten away with it. The one thing she didn't know, the one thing she never bothered to ask, the one thing she never even considered out of sheer arrogance was a very simple question. What exactly do I do for a living? If you stuck with me until the end, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Let me know in the comments which part of this story hit you the hardest and subscribe to the channel. If you want more stories like this one, I'll see you in the next one. Silence was never weakness, and patience was never surrender. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do when someone tries to destroy you is to keep building in the dark. Keep pristine records of your own life and trust that the truth, sooner or later, always finds a way to speak for itself. Honor those who taught you how to count carefully. A kind note for you. This story was created and dramatized by artificial intelligence with the intention of entertaining you while also leaving you with a positive lesson you can carry into your daily life. Listening to Renee's journey, I am profoundly struck by the quiet power of emotional restraint and resilience. We live in a loud world where people often believe that whoever screams the loudest wins the argument. Yet this story teaches us a beautiful lesson about the dignity of silence. When someone tries to tear you down, your immediate instinct might be to fight fire with fire, to let anger consume you. But true strength lies in stepping back, keeping your composure, and letting the truth be your loudest weapon. You don't have to prove your worth to people who are determined to misunderstand you. Instead, focus on building your own life, mastering your craft, and maintaining your unshakable integrity. Renee's mother gave her the greatest gift, not just in the form of a trust fund, but in the enduring values of careful preparation and honesty. We can apply this to our own lives by choosing not to react impulsively to toxic people. Let us learn to document our boundaries, protect our peace of mind, and trust that justice is a marathon, not a sprint. Greed and arrogance will always blind those who carry them, making them foolishly underestimate the quiet, steady individuals in the room. If you are walking through a dark chapter, right now remember that your patience is never a sign of surrender. Keep building your solid foundation in the dark, knowing with absolute certainty that the light will eventually reveal everything. The most profound revenge is never about inflicting pain on others. It is about living a deeply fulfilled, honest, and grounded life. Ultimately, pure goodness and meticulous truth-telling will always outlast the fragile lies built by manipulation. Please remember that the story we just shared is created solely for educational purposes, designed to spark meaningful reflection and inspire positive personal growth, so you can navigate your own life with grace and wisdom. Disclaimer: the narrative presented is a dramatized work intended strictly for educational and entertainment value. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or actual events, is entirely coincidental. This content does not constitute legal, financial, mental health, or professional advice. Always consult with a qualified professional regarding your specific personal circumstances.